Welcome to the channel. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to click like and subscribe to stay updated with our latest content. Your support helps us create more awesome videos for you. Let us know what you think in the comments below. Enjoy the video. I like to think that I take my personal safety very seriously. I don't stand too close to the road while waiting for the walk signal. I have my location shared with my sister and mom. I keep my wits about me when I'm out in public, and I try not to dawdle after getting into my car. If I had only been more diligent about that last rule, I might not be in the situation I'm in now. Early this morning, just after midnight, I was sitting in my parked car outside of my favorite grocery store. I was exhausted from picking up a friend's evening shift, and so I stopped to grab dinner on my way home from work. The store is in an isolated part of town, but I had never felt unsafe in the area. Then again, I'd never been so late at night. The second I exited the store with my purchase, the old cashier closed up shop for the night and turned off all the lights in the building. For some reason, I did something I never do. I started eating in my car. As a precaution, I try not to linger in isolated parking lots, especially as a young woman who often has to run errands after dark. Maybe it was the hunger, or maybe the fact that, due to a recent breakup, my house hasn't felt all that welcoming in the past few weeks. In any case, I was in no rush to return home. I pulled up an episode of The Terror on my phone and settled in to eat. I enjoyed a few minutes of blissful peace and quiet before a shout pierced through the night. I looked up from my phone and was surprised to find a woman standing in front of my car, waving her arms at me. My car was parked right in front of the store, facing towards the building, and there was only a thin sidewalk separating my vehicle from the store's exterior. I hadn't seen her coming at all. It was like she had emerged from the brick wall before me. She rounded my car, coming to a stop beside the driver's side window. She then started pointing at the ground, the universal signal for roll your window down. Fat chance, I thought. Though she looked sane and kempt, I had no clue what her intentions were. In fact, I felt pretty vindicated in always locking my car doors immediately after entering. The woman, perhaps seeing I was making no move to exit my vehicle, then told me something no one wants to hear. "Hey!" she shouted. "There's someone in your back seat." My mouth went dry. Time seemed to slow as 1,000 horror movie scenes raced through my head. I could almost feel the piano wire digging into my neck, the barrel pressing into my temple. I undid my seatbelt and prepared to launch myself out of the car. Now that the intruder knew I was aware of their presence, would I even have enough time to run? With one hand on the door handle, I stole a glance into the rearview mirror and saw no one. My car is a compact hatchback, meaning there's very little room for a person to hide in my cabin. Even in my exhausted state, I would have noticed someone upon looking into the mirror. My terror fading to confusion, I turned around in my seat, surveying the cabin with my own eyes, and confirmed that there was no one in my back seat. Click. When I turned back around, the woman had taken another step closer to my car. Her body was barely a foot from my door, and her fingers were wrapped around the handle. There were a few more deep clicks as she tried unsuccessfully to open the locked door. I raised my gaze, and she gave me an odd smile, as though she and I were sharing a private joke. For the first time, using the faint glow of the street lamp, I took a closer look at the woman's face. Her skin was stretched tightly across her skull, making her thin mouth and nostrils appear as though they'd been cut onto her. Her eyes were deep-set and ovate, and her teeth seemed both too small and too numerous. I allowed myself a brief moment to gawk at the face before me, and then I threw my car into reverse and hightailed it out of the lot. For a few disheartening seconds, the woman held on to the door, keeping in step with my vehicle as I backed up. Luckily, she soon let go, and I drove away, my mind racing with the realization that the woman was trying to bait me out of my car. Even more disturbing was the fact that it had almost worked. I wondered if she had others with her that I simply hadn't seen, and what she had wanted from me. I hoped I had narrowly escaped a robbery as opposed to something much more sinister. I got back to my house 20 minutes later. Still shaken from my encounter, I rushed inside the house and made sure that all of my doors and windows were locked. My exhaustion did little to soothe my nerves. My mind played tricks on me as I got ready for bed, conjuring up flashes of the woman's face in the dark corners of my house. Once I finally fell asleep, my fears followed me from the waking world. I had a long, vivid nightmare, most of which I've either forgotten or is irrelevant to this account. All I know is that when I jolted awake some hours later, it was to the sound of a frantic banging on my front door. I sat up in bed, unsure if I was still dreaming or not. My alarm clock read 4:17. It was far too early for someone to be knocking on my door unless there was some kind of emergency, which, given the forcefulness of the knocks, there may have been. Slowly, I rose from my bed and inched towards the entryway. I had never before been in such a situation and was at somewhat of a loss as to how to react. I didn't smell a fire, thankfully, but that didn't mean all was well. Suddenly, I heard a man's voice calling out my name in a questioning tone. It sounded vaguely familiar, but I couldn't immediately place it. "Who is it?" I called back. "Brian," answered the disembodied voice, and relief washed over me. My neighbor, Brian, lived in the house across the street. We weren't close exactly, but I often saw him walking down the block with his dog, Bailey. I turned on the entryway light, but as I was still in my sleepwear, I didn't want to open the door unless I had to. Instead, I called back to him. "What's the matter?" "Well," he began. I heard his voice crack and he cleared his throat. "Do you have someone over right now?" "What?" I asked, my heart skipping a beat. "No, I don't. Why do you ask?" "Well, the dog had to go out, and while I was in the yard with him, I thought I saw someone in your front window. Someone who didn't look quite right." I stilled, feeling as though I were in some terrible dream. Turning around and glancing down the dark hallway, I wished I had turned on more lights on my way to answer the door. "She followed you home," I thought. "She's in your house with you right now." I was ready to bolt out the door into the cold, but by some miracle, I had just enough presence of mind left to consider my neighbor's words more carefully. Something was wrong. I stepped away from the door. "Are you all right, Brian?" He cleared his throat again, and when he next spoke, his voice sounded slightly different from before, as though he were testing out a new timbre. "Of course, I just got a bit of a cold here, but I still wanted to check in on you." My voice wavered as I voiced a question to my neighbor. "But your dog, isn't it a girl?" Brian didn't respond. My mind reeled in the torturous silence, trying to discern whether the threat was outside the door or inside the house with me. After a full minute of complete stillness, the handle to my front door began to move. It rotated downwards as far as it could before the lock stopped it, then shook as the person on the other side of my door pulled on the handle. This happened several more times as the person tested my lock, and then there was a powerful bang, as though someone had rammed into my door with all their might. After that, there was silence again. I stood frozen in place for another minute. I had no peephole, but I worked up the nerve to walk into the living room and peer through the blinds into my front yard. In the distance, walking down the street away from my house, was a figure. Although I couldn't see the face, something deep within me knew it was the same person who had tried to open my car door. I watched her walk away into the quiet night until she disappeared from my view. Needless to say, I didn't get much sleep for the rest of the night. I split my time between roaming the perimeter of my house, looking for anything suspicious, and sitting in my kitchen running the events of the night over in my mind. The most likely explanation was that I'd been dreaming. After all, I'd nearly been baited into opening my door to a potential criminal just hours before, so it made sense that I'd have a nightmare about a similar situation. Then again, I had never, in my entire life, had a dream so vivid. Maybe, somehow the woman really did follow me home. She easily could have stuck a tracker on my car, but how in the world did she know Brian's name, and how had she impersonated him so well? The sun is setting now. I haven't left the house all day. I've been too haunted by the idea of someone, or multiple someones, trying to draw me out into the open. No matter how many times I check the house, I still feel as though I catch glimpses of the woman in my periphery, of her beady eyes and uncanny smile. I suppose I should try to get some sleep now, impossible as that seems at this point. I just needed to jot this down before I went to bed, in case A, anything happens to me, and B, you ever think about blindly trusting the warnings of a stranger. Day 2. The exhaustion I felt was bone deep, a leaden weight pressing down on me. But sleep was a distant, impossible shore. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside, sent jolts of adrenaline through me. I finally drifted into a fitful doze as the first rays of dawn painted the sky a pale, sickly gray. I woke to the insistent buzzing of my phone. It was my sister, Maya. "Hey, you okay? You didn't answer my text last night," she said, concern lacing her voice. I had completely forgotten about checking in with her, my mind consumed by the night's events. "Yeah, just a rough night," I mumbled, trying to sound normal. "Long shift." "You sound weird," Maya said, her voice sharpening. "Everything all right?" I hesitated. How could I explain the unexplainable? How could I tell her about the woman, the near break-in, the chilling impersonation of Brian? It all sounded so crazy. "Just tired," I repeated, forcing a lightness into my tone. "I'll call you later, okay?" I hung up before she could press further. The guilt gnawed at me. I should tell someone, but the fear of being dismissed, of being labeled as paranoid, held me back. My stomach churned, but I knew I needed to eat. As I made my way to the kitchen, I noticed something out of place. A small framed photo of my grandmother, which usually sat on the mantelpiece, was lying face down on the floor. I hadn't touched it. A shiver ran down my spine. I picked up the photo, my hands trembling. It was undamaged, but the sight of it lying there, deliberately placed, filled me with a new wave of unease. It was a subtle act, a silent violation, a clear message that someone had been in my house. The day stretched out, an agonizing exercise in forced normalcy. I tried to work from home, but my focus was shattered. Every shadow seemed to hold the woman's distorted face. Every sound was amplified, threatening. I decided I needed to talk to Brian, the real Brian. I needed to confirm what had happened, to know if I was losing my mind. Around noon, I saw him outside, tending to his small garden. He looked up as I approached, his usual friendly smile replaced with a strained expression. "Brian," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "can I talk to you for a minute?" He nodded slowly, his eyes darting around as if he were looking for someone. "Sure," he said, his voice unusually quiet. "About last night," I began, then hesitated. Did you come over to my house?" His brow furrowed. "No, I didn't. I was asleep. Bailey was a bit restless, but we stayed inside all night." My heart sank. It wasn't a dream. The impersonation was real. "But you called my name, right?" I pressed, desperate for some explanation that made sense. Brian shook his head, his eyes widening slightly. "I didn't call your name. I didn't leave the house." He paused, then added, "Bailey has been acting strange, though, barking at nothing, staring at the windows like she senses something." A cold dread washed over me. Even Brian's dog, known for her gentle nature, was reacting to something unseen. "Brian," I said, my voice trembling, "I think someone was trying to get into my house last night. They pretended to be you." He stared at me, his expression a mixture of disbelief and concern. "Pretended to be me? How is that even possible?" I recounted the entire story, from the grocery store encounter to the banging on my door. As I spoke, Brian's face grew paler. This is insane," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know what to say." "I don't know what to do," I confessed, my voice cracking. "I feel like I'm going crazy." Brian looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and fear. "You're not crazy," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "But you need to be careful. Maybe you should call the police." The police. The thought had crossed my mind, but I hesitated. What would I tell them? That a woman with a creepy smile tried to trick me? That someone impersonated my neighbor? They'd think I was delusional. I don't know," I said, shaking my head. "I don't have any proof. Just be careful." Brian repeated, his gaze fixed on something behind me. I turned around, following his line of sight. Across the street, standing partially hidden behind a large oak tree, was the woman. She was watching us, her uncanny smile stretched across her face. My breath caught in my throat. I felt a primal fear, a sense of being hunted. She's right there," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Brian stepped back, his eyes wide with terror. "Don't look at her," he hissed. "Just go inside." I stumbled back towards my house, my legs feeling like lead. I didn't take my eyes off the woman until I was safely inside, the door locked and bolted. Day 3. The silent phone calls started that evening. The first one came just as I was trying to eat dinner. The caller ID showed unknown number. I hesitantly answered. "Hello?" Silence. Then a faint, raspy breathing on the other end. It sounded unnatural, almost distorted. "Who is this?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The breathing continued for a few more seconds. Then the line went dead. The calls came every hour, each one more unsettling than the last. Sometimes there was only silence, sometimes the faint breathing, and once I thought I heard a whispered word, a distorted, guttural sound that I couldn't quite decipher. I tried blocking the number, but the calls kept coming, each time from a different, seemingly random number. It was as if she had an endless supply of burner phones. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the woman's face, her eyes burning into me. The house felt like a cage, a prison of my own making. I started to notice other things, small details that were out of place. A book on my nightstand moved to the floor, a kitchen drawer slightly ajar, a faint, sweet, almost sickly scent that lingered in the air, a scent I couldn't place. The gaslighting was escalating. It was subtle, insidious, designed to make me doubt my own sanity. I tried to reach out to Maya again, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her the full truth. I downplayed the events, saying I was just stressed and having some weird dreams. She seemed unconvinced, but she didn't push. I felt more alone than ever. Day 4, I decided I needed to know more about the area, about the grocery store. Maybe there was something in the local history, some clue that could explain what was happening. I drove to the local library, hoping to find some old newspaper articles or local records. The librarian, a kind elderly woman named Mrs. Davies, seemed surprised by my request. "Looking for information about the old grocery store, are you?" she said, her eyes twinkling. "That place has quite a history, you know." My heart quickened. "What kind of history?" Mrs. Davies led me to a dusty corner of the library, filled with old files and microfilms. "Well, there have always been stories," she said, her voice low. "Strange disappearances, unexplained lights, rumors of something not quite right." I spent hours poring over old newspaper clippings and local accounts. I found several articles from decades ago reporting on missing persons cases in the area around the grocery store. The victims were often women, and their disappearances were never solved. There were also vague mentions of a woman in black seen near the locations where the disappearances occurred, but the descriptions were always hazy and unreliable. A chill ran down my spine as I read the accounts. The similarities to my own experience were undeniable. It was as if history was repeating itself, and I was the next target. I found one particularly unsettling article from the 1950s. It described a series of strange occurrences at a property that used to stand where the grocery store was now located. The property was said to be cursed, haunted by a malevolent entity that preyed on vulnerable women. The article mentioned a local legend about a woman who was driven mad by the entity, eventually taking her own life. "Find anything interesting?" Mrs. Davies asked, startling me out of my thoughts. I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "Just some strange stories," I said, trying to sound casual. Mrs. Davies smiled knowingly. "That area has always had a dark reputation," she said. "Some say the land itself is tainted." She paused, then added, "Be careful, dear. Some things are best left undisturbed." Her words sent another shiver down my spine. I thanked her and left the library, my mind racing with the information I had uncovered. As I drove home, I noticed a black car parked a few blocks from my house. It was the same make and model as mine, but I couldn't see the license plate. As I drove past, I caught a glimpse of the driver. It was the woman. She was sitting in the car, staring straight ahead, her face expressionless. I sped up, my heart pounding in my chest. She was everywhere. She was inescapable. That night, the silent calls intensified. They came every few minutes, each one a reminder of her presence, her relentless pursuit. I unplugged my landline, but the calls started coming to my cell phone, again from different, untraceable numbers. I found a small, crudely made doll lying on my doorstep. It was fashioned from twigs and twine, with a piece of black fabric wrapped around it. It was a chillingly accurate representation of the woman, with its hollowed-out eyes and a thin, cruel mouth. I felt a surge of anger mixed with terror. This wasn't just harassment. It was a deliberate attempt to torment me, to break me down. I started to question everything. Was I imagining things? Was I losing my grip on reality? The gaslighting was taking its toll, blurring the lines between what was real and what was a product of my increasingly fractured mind. Day 5. I woke up to find all the mirrors in my house covered with black cloth. I hadn't done it. I knew I hadn't done it. The sight of the shrouded mirrors, reflecting nothing but darkness, filled me with a profound sense of dread. It was a symbolic act, a stripping away of my identity, my ability to see myself. I felt a growing sense of desperation. I couldn't stay in the house any longer. I needed to get away, to find some sanctuary. I decided to visit my sister, Maya. I hadn't told her the full extent of what was happening, but I needed to be near someone I trusted, someone who could offer some semblance of normalcy. As I drove to Maya's house, I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see the woman's car following me. The feeling of being watched was constant, suffocating. When I arrived at Maya's, she took one look at me and her face filled with concern. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice laced with worry. "You look terrible." I tried to smile to reassure her, but the words caught in my throat. I felt like I was on the verge of collapsing, of shattering into a million pieces. I just haven't been sleeping well," I mumbled, avoiding her gaze. Maya didn't believe me. She led me inside, sat me down on the sofa, and made me a cup of tea. "Tell me what's going on," she said gently. "You can tell me anything." I hesitated then, the words started pouring out. I told her everything, from the encounter at the grocery store to the silent calls, the moved objects, the doll, the shrouded mirrors. I told her about the feeling of being watched, the growing sense of paranoia and dread. As I spoke, Maya listened intently, her expression shifting from concern to disbelief to outright fear. This is insane," she said, shaking her head. "You need to go to the police." "I told you I don't have any proof. They would never believe me. They would think that I was crazy." "But this woman, she's stalking you, harassing you," Maya insisted. "You can't just let her get away with it." "I don't know what to do," I said, my voice breaking. "I feel like I'm losing my mind." Maya put her arm around me, pulling me close. "You're not losing your mind," she said firmly. "You're going through something terrible, but you're not alone. I'm here for you." Her words offered a small measure of comfort, but the fear still lingered, a cold knot in my stomach. We spent the rest of the day talking, trying to make sense of the situation. Maya suggested I stay with her for a while, and I gratefully accepted. I couldn't face going back to my house, to the suffocating darkness and the constant feeling of being watched. Day 6. Staying at Maya's house provided a temporary reprieve, a brief respite from the constant terror. But even there, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the woman was still out there, waiting. The silent calls continued, even to Maya's phone. It was as if the woman knew where I was, as if she could track me anywhere. One evening, while Maya was out getting groceries, I heard a knock at the door. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't expecting anyone. I peered through the peephole. It was Brian. He looked pale and shaken, his eyes wide with fear. I cautiously opened the door. "Brian? What's wrong?" She was at my house," he stammered, his voice trembling. "She was looking for you." My blood ran cold. The woman was getting closer, bolder. "What did she say?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She didn't say anything," Brian said. "She just stared at me, with that smile. Then she asked where you were. I told her I didn't know, even though Bailey was barking and growling like crazy. She was right there at my door. It was her, I'm telling you." Did she try to come inside?" "No, not exactly," Brian said, hesitating. "After I said I didn't know where you were, she just stood there for a minute, staring. Then she handed me something, told me to give it to you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. He handed it to me, his hand shaking. I unfolded the paper. It was a single handwritten sentence. "You can't hide." The words sent a fresh wave of terror through me. It was a clear threat, a reminder that she was always watching, always one step ahead. I don't know what to do," I said, my voice cracking. "I feel like I'm trapped." Brian looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and pity. Maybe you should leave town," he said. "Just get away from here." The thought had crossed my mind, but the idea of running, of leaving everything behind, was daunting. And what if she followed me? What if there was no escape? Day 7, the feeling of being trapped intensified. Even at Maya's, I felt like a prisoner, constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every sound. I decided I couldn't live like this anymore. I couldn't run. I had to confront the woman, to find out what she wanted, to try to put an end to this nightmare. I knew it was dangerous, possibly foolish, but I felt like I had no other choice. I was being driven to the edge, and I needed to push back. I decided to go back to the grocery store, the place where it all began. Maybe there was something there, some clue I had missed, some way to understand what was happening. I told Maya my plan, and she tried to dissuade me. She begged me to go to the police, to let them handle it. But I was resolute. I had to face this on my own. I drove to the grocery store late at night, the same time as my first encounter. The parking lot was deserted, the store's lights extinguished. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding. I parked my car in the same spot as before, facing the store. I sat there, my heart pounding in my chest, waiting. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The silence was broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hum of traffic. Then I saw her. She emerged from the shadows, her figure silhouetted against the faint glow of the streetlights. She walked slowly, deliberately, towards my car. My breath caught in my throat. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. This was it. She stopped in front of my car, just as she had before. Her face was even more distorted in the darkness, her smile wider, more unsettling. I rolled down the window just a crack. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice trembling. She didn't answer. She just stared at me, her eyes burning into me. "Why are you doing this?" I demanded, my voice rising. "Why are you tormenting me?" Still, she said nothing. She reached into her pocket and pulled out something small and dark. It was the clay doll, the one she had left on my doorstep. She held it up, her fingers wrapped around it tightly. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she snapped the doll in half. A sharp pain shot through my chest as if something inside me had broken. I gasped for air, clutching my chest. The woman smiled, a chilling, triumphant smile. You're hurting me," I gasped, my voice weak. She finally spoke, her voice a low, guttural whisper, barely audible. "You belong to us." The words echoed in my mind, sending a wave of icy terror through me. Us? Who were us? What did she mean? I felt a growing sense of dizziness, of unreality. The world around me seemed to be shifting, distorting. I looked at the woman, and her face began to change. It was no longer the stretched, distorted face I had seen before. It was my face. I stared at her, my mind reeling. It was me, but not me. It was a twisted, grotesque version of myself, a reflection of the fear and madness that had consumed me. The woman, my other self, reached out and touched the window. The glass shattered, showering me with shards. I screamed, a primal scream of terror and despair. I scrambled out of the car, away from the monstrous reflection, away from the woman, away from the grocery store. I ran, blindly, desperately, not knowing where I was going, only knowing that I had to escape.